A German U-boat captain holds his crew silent on the deck plates, listening for the sound of an Allied escort vessel passing overhead. He hears the propellers. Then the splash of depth charges astern. He counts the seconds, exhales, and orders a hard turn to port. And then, ahead of his bow, 24 explosions go off in his face. The British have, finally, built a weapon that kills by silence. To understand what the British were aiming at when they built the Hedgehog, you have to start with the weapon it was designed to replace, and with the specific tactical flaw the depth charge had been hiding for the entire first half of the war. The depth charge, in 1939, was the only anti-submarine weapon the Royal Navy had. It was a steel barrel filled with high explosive, fitted with a hydrostatic fuse that detonated at a preset depth. To attack a submerged U-boat, an escort vessel would acquire the target on its ASDIC set, the early British sonar, and run in at speed, dropping or firing the charges over the stern as it passed over the contact. If the charges detonated close enough to the submarine, the hydrostatic shockwave would crush the pressure hull, and the boat would die. On paper, that was a perfectly reasonable weapon system. In practice, it had a flaw so fundamental that German submarine commanders had built their entire survival doctrine around exploiting it. The flaw was sonar geometry. ASDIC worked by emitting a sound pulse and listening for the echo. But as the attacking ship closed on its target, the time between outgoing pulse and returning echo collapsed toward zero. At a certain distance, somewhere around 200 yards from the contact, the echo arrived back at the operator's headphones at the same instant as the next outgoing pulse, and the two signals merged into what the Royal Navy called the instantaneous echo. The submarine, at that moment, vanished from the operator's screen. It was still there, still very much alive, but the escort had gone deaf for the most important 30 seconds of the entire engagement. Worse than that, in order to actually drop a depth charge on the contact, the ship had to drive directly over the submarine's last known position, which meant the U-boat captain knew, almost to the second, when the attacker would lose contact, when the charges would enter the water, and how long he had to maneuver out of the lethal zone before they reached his depth. A skilled commander, hearing the ship pass overhead, would order a hard turn at that exact moment, change depth, and listen, while above him, a string of explosions detonated in the empty patch of ocean he had just left. Royal Navy analysis from the Battle of the Atlantic was unforgiving. Out of 5,174 British depth charge attacks across the war, only 85.5 U-boats were sunk by them. For every U-boat the Royal Navy killed with a depth charge, 60 got away. The Royal Navy did not need a better depth charge. It needed a different weapon entirely. It needed specifically a weapon that did not let the U-boat captain hear it coming. What the depth charge did, above everything else, was flatter the German U-boat captain by missing him noisily. It told him he was being attacked. It told him roughly where the attacker was. It gave him, with the dignity of advance warning, the chance to turn, to dive, to slip away, and to listen to the empty ocean detonating where he used to be. What the British eventually built, after 2 years of failed prototypes, was the opposite of a depth charge in every respect that mattered. The weapon they built offered no warning at all. The attacking ship did not pass overhead. The propellers did not change pitch. There was no splash of charges astern. The first thing a U-boat captain knew about an attack with the new weapon was the simultaneous detonation of multiple high explosive charges directly against his pressure hull, with no preceding sound to suggest that anything was about to happen. By the time the noise of the explosions reached him, the boat was already opening to the sea. That, in 2 sentences, is what the rest of this episode is about. The Hedgehog was not a weapon that hit U-boats more often. It was a weapon that hit U-boats without telling them it was coming. The weapon came out of the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the Admiralty's Wartime Research Office, staffed almost entirely by civilians, academics, and reservists who had been quietly told that conventional thinking was no longer required. The team that took on the depth charge problem was led by a Canadian-born chemist named Charles Goodeve, who had been put in charge of the DMWD with explicit instructions to bypass the Ordnance Board whenever the Ordnance Board got in the way, which, as it turned out, was always. By 1941, Goodeve's team had been asked to solve the depth charge problem. Their first attempt, a forward-firing weapon called the Fairley Mortar, was tested aboard HMS Whitehall, and quietly abandoned. The principle, however, was sound. A weapon that threw an explosive charge ahead of the attacking ship would put it into the sea while the U-boat was still being tracked by sonar, before the instantaneous echo cut the operator's connection to the target. The answer to the launcher problem already existed, courtesy of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a retired Royal Artillery officer who had spent the interwar years inventing things that no one in Whitehall particularly wanted. Blacker's spigot mortar inverted the conventional design. The propellant charge sat inside the bomb itself, fired against a fixed steel rod, the spigot mounted on a base plate. No reinforced barrel was required, which meant a single ship could mount many spigots at once on a relatively light frame. Blacker had taken the idea to the Admiralty before the war and been told there was no naval requirement. The Ordnance Board had said no. The Ordnance Board had, in fact, said no to the spigot mortar 3 separate times across 3 separate decades to 3 separate inventors. When Goodeve revived the design in 1941, a senior Ordnance Board member is said to have told him, with the resigned authority of a man who had heard it all before, "If God Almighty himself sponsored the spigot mortar, I tell you it would still be turned down by the Ordnance Board." Goodeve, with the explicit authority to bypass the Ordnance Board, sponsored it anyway. The team's decisive contribution was to take Blacker's single-shot weapon and multiply it. 24 bombs, mounted on a frame of 4 cradles holding 6 spigots each, fired in a staggered sequence so that all 24 landed on the water at almost exactly the same instant, in a circular pattern roughly 40 yards across, 200 yards ahead of the bow. That pattern, viewed from above, looked exactly like the spines of a hedgehog raised in alarm. The name came from a competition held inside the DMWD, with a bottle of sherry as the prize. Each hedgehog projectile was a fat steel bomb, roughly 7 inches across, weighing 65 pounds, and carrying a 35-pound Torpex charge in its nose. Torpex was a wartime British explosive considerably more powerful than TNT, and 35 pounds of it, detonated against the pressure hull of a U-boat, was more than enough to open that hull to the sea. The early hedgehog projectiles were manufactured by Boozy and Hawkes, a London company best known, then and now, for making clarinets and brass instruments. The men who built the bombs that killed German submarines spent the rest of their working lives tuning trumpets for orchestras. The crucial difference between a hedgehog projectile and a depth charge, however, was not the weight of the explosive. It was the fuse. A depth charge detonated at a preset depth, regardless of whether anything was nearby. A hedgehog projectile detonated only on contact with a hard object, which in practice meant the steel hull of a submarine. If a hedgehog salvo missed, none of the 24 bombs detonated at all. They sank to the seabed, settled into the silt, and remained quietly inert. That, in turn, solved the second great flaw of the depth charge. A detonating depth charge, even a missing one, filled the surrounding water with explosion noise, churned bubbles, and pressure shock that blinded ASDIC for as much as 15 minutes. And a skilled U-boat commander used those 15 minutes to slip away. With a hedgehog, the absence of detonation meant the absence of disturbance, which meant the escort could hold sonar contact through a missed attack, swing around, and fire a second salvo without ever losing track of the target. And the projectiles fell fast. At a sink rate of 23 feet per second, a hedgehog salvo could reach a U-boat at 200 feet of depth in under 9 seconds. A fraction of the time it took a depth charge to drift down to the same level. The U-boat captain, who had been counting on his evasive turn to save him, simply did not have time to make it. 24 bombs ahead of the bow, in a circle, on a sonar contact, with no detonation unless one of them touched steel. The prototype Hedgehog was tested aboard HMS Westcott in 1941 and went into series production the following year. By the end of 1942, roughly 100 Royal Navy escorts were carrying the weapon, and the first confirmed U-boat kill came in November of that year. The early service record, however, was disappointing. The initial kill rate was around 5%, only marginally better than depth charges, and crews lost confidence in the weapon almost as quickly as they had been issued with it. Heavy North Atlantic weather covered the launcher in spray, fouling the firing circuits and producing incomplete patterns. An early premature detonation aboard HMS, escapade nearly blew the bows off the destroyer, killing several of the crew, and the story went around the fleet faster than any official communication could correct it. By early 1943, the situation had become so bad that the Royal Navy issued a formal directive, ordering captains of Hedgehog-equipped ships to report, in writing, why they had not used the weapon on any underwater contact. The reports came back unanimous. The crews did not trust it. They preferred the comforting noise of a depth charge attack, even an unsuccessful one, to the silent disappointment of a Hedgehog miss. The DMWD responded by sending one of its own officers to the escort base at Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where the convoy crews were stationed between Atlantic crossings. He gave shipwide talks, walked through successful Hedgehog attacks step by step, drilled crews on the firing sequence, and convinced skeptical captains that the weapon worked when it was used properly. The kill rate began to climb almost immediately. By the end of the war, the numbers were unrecognizable. Across 268 Hedgehog attacks recorded by the Royal Navy, 47 U-boats were sunk. On average, by 1945, one Hedgehog attack in 5 killed its target. One depth charge attack in 80 did the same. The Royal Navy had built a weapon that was, attack for attack, somewhere between 10 and 16 times more lethal than the weapon it had been designed to supplement. What the numbers did not capture, however, was what the Hedgehog had done to the men on the receiving end. German submariners, who had nicknames for almost every Allied weapon they encountered, found this one harder to laugh about. The Kriegsmarine's response was to bring forward a program that had been sitting on the back burner since before the war: the development of acoustic homing torpedoes that could be fired from depth without the captain ever needing to put a periscope above the surface to aim them. The first of these, the Falk, entered service in 1943. The reasoning was straightforward. If the British had finally built a weapon that could kill you while you were still hidden, the only answer was to kill them first, from a depth at which they could not see you at all. The Hedgehog did not just kill U-boats. It changed the way the Battle of the Atlantic was fought, forcing the Kriegsmarine off its old surface attack doctrine and into a deeper, blinder, more cautious posture, and transferring the initiative, gradually but unmistakably, from the wolf packs to the escorts that were now hunting them. On the morning of June 6, 1944, 3 flotillas of British landing craft carried Hedgehogs instead of troops, firing them onto the beaches at Normandy to clear obstacles before the assault waves arrived. The same weapon that had quietly killed U-boats in deep water was now opening corridors through the German defenses on the French coast. The United States Navy, on receiving examples through reverse Lend-Lease, adopted the Hedgehog in 1942 and deployed it across its own destroyer escorts, where it proved, if anything, even more effective than it had been in Royal Navy service. The Hedgehog itself remained in service for 40 more years. Even after the Royal Navy introduced heavier successors, no escort captain ever forgot what the Hedgehog had quietly proved: that the future of anti-submarine warfare lay ahead of the Bull, not astern of it. Stuart Blacker, the retired colonel whose pre-war pitch to the Admiralty had been politely refused, lived to see his rejected idea become standard equipment on every escort vessel in the British and American fleets. Charles Goodeve, the chemist who had bypassed the Ordnance Board to make it happen, became Sir Charles Goodeve in 1946. Returned for a moment to a U-boat captain in the North Atlantic in 1943. He hears the propellers above him pass, and he begins his evasive turn, because for 3 years that turn has been the difference between life and death. Except this time, the propellers do not pass overhead. The escort is 200 yards short of his position, and is firing 24 contact-fused bombs over its own bow into the patch of water directly in front of his hull, none of which will detonate unless one of them strikes him. He has nothing to count, nothing to hear, nothing to plan against. The British have, very quietly, removed every advantage his crew used to enjoy. The Royal Navy did not win the Battle of the Atlantic with the Hedgehog alone. Long-range maritime aircraft, improved sonar, code breaking at Bletchley Park, and the sheer weight of American shipbuilding all played their parts. But the Hedgehog was the first weapon on the British side of the war that did not flatter the U-boat captain by missing him noisily. It was a weapon that, by saying nothing, said everything. And the German submarine service, in the months and years that followed, never quite recovered from the silence. That closes the Atlantic file on the battle ledger. Where we go next, we leave the cold gray water of the North Atlantic behind for the green walls of the Burmese jungle, and a different kind of British improvisation, this time made of paper, plywood, and the surprising willingness of one American officer to throw away the entire infantry rulebook on the basis of what an Englishman with a bushy mustache had told him about a railway in 1943. Next episode, we go inside the long-range penetration columns that walked behind Japanese lines for months at a time, fed by airdrop, navigated by Royal Air Force liaison officers, and armed with a weapon set so unconventional that the men carrying it were, for a long while afterward, not officially supposed to have existed at all. Subscribe. You don't want to miss this one. Gary Gordon's rifle was a commercial catalog item bought from Colt. Randy Shugert's rifle was a weapon his own army had tried to retire. The exploding rat was 100 dead rodents that never went off. And the hedgehog was 24 British spikes that, when they worked, never gave the enemy the courtesy of a warning. All four did more damage than their makers ever planned for.